January 18th, 2001, Miami, Florida. Geralyn Graham, the foster mother of 4-year-old Rilya Wilson, claims that a female caseworker from the Florida Department of Children and Families took Rilya from her residence for a medical evaluation but never returned. Rilya is not reported missing until 15 months later, but the authorities become convinced that Geralyn fabricated her story and is responsible for Rilya's disappearance. Geralyn is eventually charged with numerous crimes and is convicted of kidnapping and child abuse at her trial, but she continues to deny any involvement and no trace of Rilya is ever found. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and this week we're going to be covering a controversial and heartbreaking missing children's case, the 2001 disappearance of 4-year-old Rilya Wilson. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Jaclyn Collins, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Jaclyn. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for over 8 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, the disappearance of Rilya Wilson is the case that Jaclyn requested I cover when she originally entered this contest, and this is one of those infuriating disappearances in which it turned out that a child had been missing for a lengthy period of time before an investigation was officially launched. At the time she was last confirmed to be alive, Rilya and her younger sister were in foster care and living with a woman named Geralyn Graham, who claimed that sometime in January of 2001, a female caseworker from the Florida Department of Children and Families showed up at her home and took Rilya away for some sort of medical evaluation, but never brought her back. Unfortunately, it would be 15 months before Rilya was even reported missing to the authorities, following a scandal where Rilya's actual caseworker for the Department of Children and Families was discovered to be filing fraudulent reports about scheduled visits to her foster children's residences. At first, the police seemed to be sympathetic towards Geralyn, but eventually came to suspect that her story about Rilya being picked up by a woman was false, and wondered if Geralyn herself may have been personally responsible for the child's disappearance. After investigators discovered that Geralyn had been accepting state benefits for Rilya's care after she went missing, she was charged with numerous counts of fraud, and once they became convinced that she killed Rilya, Geralyn would be indicted on the charges of kidnapping, child abuse, and first-degree murder. The case would contain a number of twists and turns, but when Geralyn finally went on trial, she was convicted on the kidnapping and child abuse charges, though the jury deadlocked on the murder charge. Regardless, Geralyn still received a lengthy prison sentence, but given that Rilya's remains have never been found, there was no direct evidence of foul play, and Geralyn had never admitted to any culpability in Rilya's disappearance, there are a number of unanswered questions about what actually happened, and this case does not have a definitive or satisfying resolution. The one thing which is clear-cut is that Rilya was failed in every conceivable way by a number of different people, so we're definitely going to have a lot to talk about on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page is around 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Rilya Wilson. Our story begins in Miami, Florida, and our victim is Rilya Shanice Wilson. Rilya was born in Miami on September the 29th, 1996, to her mother Gloria Wilson, who gave her the name Rilya because it was an acronym for Remember, I Love You Always. By this point, Gloria already had two older daughters named Rena and Randy, but as we're going to talk about in a few moments, the identity of Rilya's birth father is unclear. Gloria led a troubled lifestyle as after abusing alcohol during her teens, she dropped out of high school to become an exotic dancer and eventually developed an addiction to crack cocaine. During her own childhood, Gloria had been removed from her family's home and placed in foster care, and sadly, the same thing would happen with her daughters, as Gloria did not seem to have much interest in raising them. Shortly after Rilya was born, she was being watched by a guardian when Gloria picked her up for a visit, but Gloria came back and returned Rilya a short time later because she said she could not stand the child's constant crying. One of Gloria's neighbors became concerned that her children were being neglected and notified the Florida Department of Children and Families, aka the DCF, who launched an investigation. When Rilya was only 5 weeks old, the DCF removed her from Gloria's care, and her two sisters, Rena and Randy, would later be adopted by other families. For the next few years, Rilya would be placed in the custody of a woman named Pamela Kendrick, who lived in Miami's Brownsville neighborhood. In 1999, Gloria gave birth to another daughter named Rodrika, but her addiction issues were out of control, so when Rodrika was 3 months old, she was also removed from Gloria's care. The DCF eventually filed a petition to terminate Gloria's parental rights for all of her children, and she moved back to her original hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. Well, by this point, Rodrika was living with a 54-year-old woman named Geralyn Graham, as Gloria had previously become acquainted with one of Geralyn's daughters in the Narcotics Anonymous Substance Abuse Rehabilitation Center, and after meeting Geralyn herself, Gloria decided to name her as Rilya and Rodrika's godmother. Geralyn would claim that one of her sons, Kenneth Epson, was Rilya's biological father, alleging that he had conceived a total of 14 children with a number of different women. Gloria always denied this, and since Kenneth never actually took a paternity test to confirm he was Rilya's father, it's never been definitively proven if Rilya and Geralyn were biological relatives. Whatever the case, Geralyn seemed anxious to take Rilya into her care, as in April of 2000, she launched a complaint with the DCF alleging that the conditions at Pamela Kendrick's residence were filthy and in complete disarray, as she reportedly went in there and saw Rilya sitting on the floor next to a pile of feces. Kendrick always denied this, claiming that Geralyn never even set foot in her home, and she maintained that Rilya was well cared for and she loved the child as if she were her own daughter. Indeed, numerous witnesses would later say that Rilya seemed happy and well-adjusted while living with Kendrick, but after Geralyn launched her complaint, the DCF felt there was good cause to remove Rilya from Kendrick's home, and they placed her in Geralyn's care. Since Geralyn had suffered some injuries and health issues during a serious accident years earlier, her legal guardian was another Pamela, 36-year-old Pamela Graham, who technically also became the temporary legal guardian for Rilya and Rodrika. Pamela lived with Geralyn and claimed to be her younger half-sister, though as we're going to discuss in a little while, this turned out not to be true. Regardless, Rilya joined Rodrika by moving into Geralyn and Pamela's residence on Southwest 145th Place in the West Kendall neighborhood. Pamela was employed as an accountant, and since Geralyn was living on Social Security disability benefits, she would stay home and take care of the two children. Rilya's case was assigned to a DCF caseworker named Deborah Muskelly, who was obligated to perform monthly visits to the Graham residence to check on Rilya and Rodrika's welfare. Muskelly's original report said glowing things about the situation, as the two sisters were described as being quote-unquote very happy and well cared for, and living in a quote-unquote safe and clean environment. There were apparently plans for Geralyn to legally adopt Rilya, but a few months after her 4th birthday, the child just seemed to vanish without a trace. This would not come to anyone's attention until 2002, when an internal audit was performed at the DCF and discovered that Deborah Muskelly had been committing fraud by falsely documenting a number of home visits to check on her foster children's welfare. In addition to her position as a DCF caseworker, Muskelly had obtained a second job as a substitute adult education teacher, but since it was impossible for her to simultaneously juggle both positions, Muskelly falsified records of these non-existent home visits and fraudulently billed the state more than $7,000 for them. The scandal led to the resignation of both Muskelly and her supervisor, Willie Harris, who was obliged to review all case files from each worker in his unit every 3 months, but he had failed to do so. They would both later say that their actions were the result of an overwhelming workload, as the DCF had nearly 32,000 foster children in their care at that time, but they were grossly understaffed. Naturally, the DCF launched an investigation in which they would check up on all the foster children whose home visits had been falsified in Muskelly's records, and 2 of them were Rilya and Rilya Wilson. In April of 2002, another caseworker named Dora Betancourt was assigned to pay a visit to Geralyn Graham's residence to check on the 2 siblings, but when she arrived, she was surprised to discover that Rilya was no longer there, as Geralyn claimed she had not actually seen Rilya in 15 months, and stated, quote, "Well, I don't have her. You guys took her from me a year ago," end quote. According to Geralyn, the last date she saw Rilya was on January the 18th, 2001, as she said that a black woman claiming to work for the DCF suddenly showed up at her home. While Geralyn never learned the woman's name, she said that she spoke with a thick accent, which may have been African or Caribbean in origin, and she seemed to be familiar with Rilya's history. Geralyn claimed that after taking Rilya into her care, the child had displayed a number of behavioral issues, as she supposedly spread feces throughout the house and violently attacked her sister by trying to smother Roderica with a pillow and push her under the water in the bathtub. Since Geralyn had reported these issues to the DCF, the woman told her that she needed to take Rilya away for an extended period of time in order to undergo some sort of medical evaluation which would involve psychological and neurological testing. After Geralyn agreed to do this, she helped put Rilya in the woman's car and fastened her seatbelt before they drove away, but she maintained that this was the last time she ever saw Rilya. A few days later, Geralyn said that a different woman, claiming to be from the DCF, showed up at her residence to collect Rilya's clothing and her toys. A few weeks after that, Geralyn said that an unidentified man from the DCF briefly paid her a visit to inquire about Rilya and Roderica's well-being because he did not know that Rilya had already been taken away. After this, Geralyn claimed that she received no more visits from the DCF, and even though she frequently phoned them and paid visits to their office to inquire about Rilya's status, they never told her where she was or when she would return home. Well, the DCF did not have any record of having removed Rilya from Geralyn's residence on that particular date, so Geralyn was asked to come down to their headquarters to look through binders containing photographs of their past and present employees to see if she could identify the woman who paid her a visit. She was unable to make an identification, though she did confirm that Deborah Muskelly was not the woman who took Rilya away or returned to her residence to collect Rilya's clothing and toys. After the DCF contacted the Miami-Dade Police Department and informed them about what was going on, a missing persons report was officially filed for Rilya on April the 25th. Well, needless to say, Rilya's disappearance ballooned into a major news story as the whole situation painted the DCF in a very negative light and eventually led to the resignation of their secretary, Kathleen Kearney. A number of reforms were eventually passed in Florida's foster care system, as lawmakers would pass a bill which made it a felony for state employees to falsify or destroy public records about children who were under the state's supervision. Florida Congresswoman Rilya Wilson, no relation, would also later introduce the Rilya Wilson Act, which required state child welfare agencies to report information on missing or abducted foster children promptly to law enforcement so that the disappearances could then be reported to the National Crime Information Center. The bill also made it mandatory for all children in the state under the age of 3 who were under court-ordered protective supervision or in out-of-home care to be enrolled in an early education or childhood program that required attendance at least 5 times per week. The Rilya Wilson Act wound up officially being passed by the Florida legislature in July of 2003. Once Rilya's disappearance started receiving attention from the media, Geralyn did a number of interviews in which she shared her story about Rilya being taken away by an unidentified DCF worker. She openly cast suspicion towards Deborah Muskelly, claiming that she tried to contact her to learn Rilya's whereabouts, and even though Muskelly assured her that Rilya would be returned in the near future, this never took place. In response, Muskelly's attorney told the media that she had no knowledge or involvement in Rilya's disappearance, as he felt that Muskelly was being used as a scapegoat by the DCF to mask their own internal problems. During the early stages of the investigation, Geralyn was not considered to be a suspect, as Detective Lupo Jimenez, the lead investigator from the Miami-Dade PD, told the media, quote, "She's just as confused as we are. I know she has made several attempts to follow up on the case," end quote. Rilya's birth mother, Gloria, was still living in Cleveland at this point and claimed she had not been in contact with Rilya or Geralyn in years, so she was also not considered to be a suspect. At the outset, it was initially believed that Rilya might be an unidentified African-American child known only as Precious Doe, whose decapitated body and severed head had been found in a park in Kansas City, Missouri in April of 2001, only 3 months after Rilya went missing. However, after a DNA sample was obtained from Gloria, testing showed no genetic connection between her and Precious Doe, which ruled out the possibility that the victim was Rilya. In 2005, DNA testing finally identified Precious Doe as 3-year-old Erica Green, who had been murdered by her mother and stepfather. In May of 2002, Rilya's disappearance would be featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, though this did not lead to any substantial new tips. There would be some controversy surrounding the episode, as based on Geralyn's description, noted sketch artist Jeannie Boylan had drawn up a composite sketch of the unidentified woman who had taken Rilya from her residence. However, the problem was that Geralyn provided her description after looking through photographs of past and present DCF employees, whereas the standard procedure is for witnesses to provide their descriptions to sketch artists before they've had the opportunity to view photographs or a lineup of potential suspects. Therefore, the producers of America's Most Wanted felt that the composite sketch of the woman had been compromised and elected not to feature it on the show. Well, the investigation soon went in a new direction when Geralyn and Pamela Graham were each given polygraph tests, and the Miami-Dade PD announced that the results indicated that both women showed signs of deception. It also turned out that Geralyn had quite a troubled background, as investigators discovered that she used over 40 different aliases throughout the course of her life and had a history of troubles with the law. Decades earlier, Geralyn had been arrested no less than 5 times in Miami-Dade County for such offenses as passing bad checks and grand theft after she stole $8,500 from a truck rental company. She was sentenced to 5 years probation and ordered to pay restitution, but in 1985, while living in Tennessee under the pseudonym Geralyn Savage, she wound up spending time in prison for food stamp fraud. Following her release, Geralyn had no further arrests for criminal activity, but she was known for being very litigious and had filed at least 8 lawsuits over such issues as personal injury compensation, child support, and allegations of racial discrimination. Geralyn had also been sued by no less than 12 creditors and was named in 7 landlord-tenant disputes. One of Geralyn's lawsuits had been against a rental car company after she suffered serious injuries in an accident in 1996, which is why she was declared legally disabled and could not work. The accident caused Geralyn to struggle with memory loss and hallucinations, and a physician from the Neurologic Center of South Florida diagnosed her as suffering from dementia and organic personality syndrome, a mental disorder resulting from physical damage or dysfunction in the brain, which has similar symptoms to schizophrenia. Needless to say, this once again painted an unflattering portrayal of the DCF, as many people wondered why they would have allowed someone with such a troubled background to be a foster mother for two young children. There would be another surprising revelation involving Geralyn's so-called half-sister, Pamela Graham, as it turned out they were likely not related at all. Even though they claimed they had the same father, their birth certificates actually listed different fathers for each of them. The story goes that they originally met in Arkansas in 1994 before they relocated to Miami, and Pamela told coworkers that Geralyn was her wife. Even though gay marriage was not legalized at that time, Pamela and Geralyn had reportedly once gone through a commitment ceremony together, and Geralyn later told the press that she and Pamela had been involved in a quote-unquote loving but non-sexual relationship. There would be further confusion about the relationships between all the people in the story when investigators were contacted by a career criminal named Manville Cash, who was serving time in the Miami-Dade County Jail on auto theft and drug charges. Manville claimed that he was Gloria Wilson's former boyfriend and Rilya's biological father, and had been in and out of jail multiple times since the child's birth. While Manville has never taken a paternity test to confirm this, he was listed as Rilya's quote-unquote prospective father on the DCF documents which terminated Gloria's parental rights. Manville also happened to be the nephew of Rilya's former foster mother, Pamela Kendrick, and claimed that he used to see Rilya 3 times per week, and that his last interaction with her took place at Rilya's 3rd birthday party in September of 1999. However, Manville denied the allegations that Kendrick's residence had been an unfit environment for Rilya, as he said that she seemed to be a sweet, well-adjusted child while she was living there. Indeed, even though Geralyn had complained that the conditions of Kendrick's residence were filthy and Rilya was being neglected there, it seemed apparent that the DCF had not fully investigated these allegations before making their decision to remove Rilya from the home and place her in Geralyn's care. Well, shortly after Rilya was reported missing, the DCF made the decision to remove her younger sister, Roderica, from Geralyn's residence, as an evaluation revealed that she was suffering from developmental problems and had not received the proper medical care for an untreated eye condition. Since Geralyn was now being investigated as a potential suspect in Rilya's disappearance, she and Pamela lost custody of Roderica, who would later be adopted by another family. Holes began to open up in Geralyn's story, as even though she maintained that she made numerous phone calls to the DCF and numerous visits to their office to inquire about Rilya's whereabouts, the DCF did not have any record of this. In fact, Deborah Muskelly even claimed that Geralyn had spoken with her on the phone on at least 2 occasions in August of 2001 and February of 2002, and said that Rilya was still living with her and was healthy. Dora Betancourt, the DCF caseworker who was assigned to Rilya's case after Muskelly resigned, claimed that she attempted to call Geralyn and Pamela 4 times and left them numerous messages on their answering machine. When Pamela finally entered the phone and spoke to Betancourt, she never mentioned anything about Rilya no longer living with her during their initial conversation. And oddly, Pamela also told Betancourt that she had left a voicemail with her, even though Betancourt did not have voicemail and had only left her pager number during her answering machine messages. It was only after Betancourt scheduled an in-person appointment and paid a visit to the Graham residence when Geralyn finally shared the story about Rilya being taken by the mysterious woman posing as a DCF caseworker. If that wasn't enough, investigators spoke to no less than 6 witnesses who claimed that Geralyn had provided an altogether different story about why Rilya was no longer living with her. Geralyn allegedly said that during an outing at the park, she met a Spanish woman with the surname Gomez or Gonzalez who was quite taken with Rilya and agreed to bring her on a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. They then returned to Miami, and Geralyn told people that Rilya was now living with the Spanish woman who had informally adopted her. Of course, this was in direct contradiction to Geralyn's story about Rilya being taken by a female DCF worker, and when confronted about this, Geralyn maintained that the story about the Spanish woman was true, but she actually returned Rilya to her following the trip to New York, and Rilya was then taken by the DCF woman. Two other friends who visited Geralyn at her home during 2001 said that Rilya was not there at the time, and when they asked Geralyn about the child, she supposedly provided yet another different story by replying that Rilya had become too much to handle, so she gave her back to the DCF. Investigators also spoke to a medical worker who claimed that Geralyn brought Rodrika to see them for a medical checkup in February of 2001, and that Rilya accompanied them there, even though the child had supposedly been taken from Geralyn's custody on January the 18th. For her part, Geralyn denied that Rilya was present during this appointment. The Miami-Dade PD performed a search of the Graham residence, but did not find any evidence that foul play had taken place there. However, it turned out there was ample evidence of fraud from the Grahams. As foster parents, they had monthly paychecks sent to their residence by the state of Florida for Rilya's care, but even though Rilya was not in her custody for over a year, Geralyn continued to cash the checks. Geralyn claimed that she called the DCF and attempted to correct this, but was told she could keep the money since it would be too difficult to reapply for the subsidies at a later time. However, Geralyn still continued to apply for food stamps and welfare benefits from the state during this time period, while listing Rilya as a dependent on the application forms, even though the child was no longer in her care. During this time period, Geralyn had numerous interviews with a DCF employee named Mary Rosado, who was responsible for approving financial assistance, and Geralyn provided her with a court order awarding her custody of Rilya, which turned out to be fabricated. Rosado also claimed that Geralyn only ever showed up to these interviews with Rodrika and never brought Rilya along, as Geralyn always said that she left Rilya with relatives because it was too difficult to handle two children. In total, Geralyn had accepted over $14,000 worth of benefits after Rilya disappeared, so on October 2nd, 2002, both she and Pamela were arrested on multiple counts of fraud. Geralyn was charged with 7 counts of public assistance fraud and 1 count each of forgery, driver's license fraud, title fraud, and making a false affidavit. These additional charges came about because of an incident where Geralyn had stolen a friend's identity in order to purchase a $29,000 SUV. As for Pamela, she was charged with 5 counts of welfare fraud, 6 counts of aiding and abetting public assistance fraud, and 1 count of grand theft. In addition, Geralyn's adult son and daughter, Leo and Jaclyn Epson, were also arrested, as Leo was charged with grand theft for defrauding $7,000 from a homeless shelter, while Jaclyn was charged with public assistance fraud for stealing $200 worth of food stamps. According to Catherine Fernandez Rundle, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Geralyn had only been pretending to care about Rilya for her benefits, stating, quote, "This would-be grandmother became a grandmother for the money only," end quote. Geralyn was held under a $150,000 bond in the Miami-Dade County Jail, but since Pamela's bond was a more affordable $15,000, she was released from jail and placed under house arrest. Leo and Jaclyn both agreed to plea deals in which they would plead guilty to their charges and receive respective sentences of 2 years and 1 year's probation, as well as 200 hours and 100 hours of community service. They were also informed that if they agreed to take lie detector tests and be questioned about Rilya's case, their hours of community service would be dropped, but Leo and Jaclyn declined this part of the offer and refused to take the tests. In January of 2003, Geralyn went on trial for the fraud charges related to stealing her friend's identity to purchase the SUV, and after she was found guilty of all these charges, she received a 2-year jail sentence. In May of that year, Geralyn agreed to plead guilty to the public assistance fraud charges in exchange for an additional 2-year prison sentence at the Women's Detention Center, which would begin after she completed her previous 2-year sentence in the Miami-Dade County Jail. In August, Pamela agreed to plead guilty to most of her charges and received a sentence of 2 years probation, and she was ordered to pay over $13,000 in restitution. Pamela was also sentenced to 100 hours of community service, and much like Leo and Jaclyn, she was offered the opportunity to have this part of her sentence dropped if she agreed to submit to a lie detector test and be formally questioned about Rilya's disappearance, but she also refused to do so. In October, Deborah Muskelly would be indicted on no less than 41 criminal charges for her fraudulent activities at the DCF. She eventually agreed to a plea deal in which she would plead guilty to 1 count of grand theft and 1 count of official misconduct in exchange for the 39 other charges being dropped. She received a sentence of 5 years probation and was ordered to pay $5,000 in restitution to the state. Well, the investigation into Rilya's disappearance continued while Geralyn continued serving her sentence on the fraud charges, but stories began to emerge about Geralyn having subjected Rilya to numerous acts of abuse while she was in her care, which included locking the child up in a dog cage which she had borrowed from a friend. In August of 2004, it was announced that Geralyn had been charged with kidnapping and 3 counts of aggravated child abuse, while Pamela was charged with 2 lesser counts of child abuse/neglect. The authorities believed that Pamela did not directly participate in Rilya's abuse, but had failed to protect the child from the abuse she suffered at the hands of Geralyn. Pamela finally admitted her own culpability and agreed to a plea deal in which she would plead guilty to the abuse/neglect charges and testify against Geralyn in exchange for a lesser sentence of 364 days in the Miami-Dade County Jail, followed by 5 years probation. Pamela confirmed that Geralyn would punish Rilya by locking her up in a dog cage in a small laundry room, but said it was only done to curtail Rilya's behavioral issues and prevent her from hurting everyone else in the household. Pamela also said that Geralyn would spank Rilya with switches and tie her to the bed using plastic flex cuffs so that she could not get up during the night. There was even one occasion when Geralyn supposedly dipped Rilya into some scalding water in the bathtub as punishment for wetting the bed, as well as an incident where Pamela returned home and noticed that Rilya had severe burns from the hot water heater in the laundry room, though Geralyn insisted that they were the result of an accident. However, Pamela claimed she did not know Rilya's current whereabouts and could not confirm if she was dead or alive. According to Pamela, she last saw Rilya sometime in December of 2000, not January of 2001, as she said that Geralyn phoned her at work one day to say that she and Rilya were going on a quote-unquote errand. But when Pamela returned home that evening, Rilya was gone, and Geralyn would not tell her where she was, even after Pamela spent all night crying and begging Geralyn to reveal what happened. Geralyn only told Pamela that Rilya was okay and she had not hurt her, but they wouldn't be seeing the child anymore. When the authorities became involved, Geralyn asked Pamela to lie on her behalf and back up her false cover story about the female DCF worker taking Rilya away. After Pamela went on record with her story, Geralyn agreed to provide an exclusive jailhouse interview to the Miami Herald in which she denied all of Pamela's allegations and continued to maintain that her original story about the DCF worker was true. Well, even though Rilya's body could not be found and there was no physical evidence of foul play, investigators still presented a case for first-degree murder to a grand jury, and Geralyn would be indicted in March of 2005. This indictment came about because of new testimony provided by Robin Lunsford, an inmate who had shared a cell with Geralyn. According to Lunsford, she heard Geralyn give a tearful confession to Rilya's murder and told her that she had killed the child because she was quote-unquote evil and had been plagued by quote-unquote demons. Geralyn allegedly said that the big turning point was when Rilya had refused to wear an angel costume for Halloween and wanted to dress up as Cleopatra instead, which made Geralyn conclude that the child was evil and needed to die, so she proceeded to smother her with a pillow. Geralyn also said that she buried Rilya's body in a canal or a lake in the southern section of Miami-Dade County, at a location where she had previously gone fishing and held cookouts. Well, the big issue was that Robin Lunsford was a career criminal with no less than 15 convictions for robbery and a history of prison escapes, and she was a known jailhouse informant who had offered to testify in murder cases in order to help her own legal situation. At the time she was incarcerated with Geralyn, Lunsford was awaiting trial on an armed robbery charge and facing the maximum sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole under Florida's habitual violent offender laws. At the outset, Lunsford claimed that after hearing Geralyn admit to Rilya's murder, she went to the authorities simply because it was the right thing to do and she was not expecting any leniency. However, in August of that year, 5 months after the murder indictment, a bail hearing was held for Geralyn in which Lunsford was scheduled to testify, but Lunsford invoked her Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination and refused to answer any questions. Lunsford said that her attorney had advised her to do this because her testimony could have affected her upcoming armed robbery trial, but she was also apparently not happy that the prosecution was willing to offer her a 20-year sentence in exchange for her testimony against Geralyn when she was hoping that her sentence would be reduced to 3 to 5 years. Lunsford's armed robbery trial soon began, and sure enough, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole, which meant that the state no longer had any leverage in order to convince her to testify against Geralyn. So the case against Geralyn remained in a holding pattern for the next 7 years, as even after she completed serving her sentence on the fraud charges, Geralyn remained incarcerated in the Women's Detention Center on a $200,000 bond, while the state determined whether or not the evidence would be strong enough to bring her to trial on the kidnapping, child abuse, and murder charges. Prosecutors did eventually reach an agreement with Robin Lunsford in which her life sentence would be reduced to 10 years in prison in exchange for her testimony, and after numerous delays, Geralyn's trial finally began in December of 2012. In addition to Robin Lunsford, corroborating testimony would be provided by a pair of convicted murderers named Ramona Tavia and Maggie Carr, who both claimed that they heard Geralyn make incriminating statements while she was incarcerated. Tavia said that while they were sharing a cell together, Geralyn made a tearful confession to killing a quote-unquote baby and said she did so in order to protect her quote-unquote sister. Carr testified that Geralyn frequently inquired to her about whether a person could be convicted of murder without a body and made some remarks to suggest that she had disposed of Rilya's body near some water. Of course, the key witness would be Pamela Graham, who testified that she had seen Geralyn abuse Rilya on numerous occasions. Geralyn's defense continued to maintain that there was no direct evidence that Rilya was even dead, let alone that Geralyn had murdered her. She continued to stick to her original story that Rilya had been abducted by a woman posing as a DCF caseworker, and the defense pushed forward the possibility that Rilya may have been sold and was still alive somewhere under a new identity with no idea of who she really was. Deborah Muskelly took the stand to testify, and even though she admitted to having falsified reports about visiting and checking up on Rilya, she continued to deny that she or anyone else affiliated with the DCF were responsible for the child's disappearance. In total, the trial would last for 8 weeks and ran into the new year before it finally wound up in the hands of the jury. On January the 25th, 2013, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury announced that they had found Geralyn guilty on the charge of kidnapping and all 3 counts of aggravated child abuse. However, they could not reach a verdict on the murder charge and remained deadlocked on a vote of 11-1, as one jury did not believe that the evidence for murder was strong enough to convict Geralyn beyond a reasonable doubt. While Circuit Court Judge Marissa Tinkler Mendez declared a mistrial on the murder charge, she still sentenced Geralyn to 30 years in prison for kidnapping, 25 years each for 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, and a 5-year sentence on the lesser included offense of child abuse. While all the child abuse sentences would run concurrently, they would run consecutively with the sentence on the kidnapping charge, which meant that at a minimum, Geralyn would have to serve at least 55 years in prison. By this point, Geralyn was 67 years old, which meant this was essentially a life sentence. Over the course of the next several months, the state changed their mind multiple times about whether or not they were planning to retry Geralyn on the murder charge, but they ultimately decided not to go through with it. As far as I can tell, Geralyn is still languishing behind bars today, but has yet to admit any culpability in Rilya's disappearance. Even though Rilya is presumed to be deceased, no one has technically been convicted of her murder, and her remains have still never been found, so the truth about what actually happened to her remains unclear. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So over the years, there are certain cases which I receive numerous requests to cover, but I decide that I need to be in the right frame of mind before I put together an episode because the details are so terrible, and the disappearance of Rilya Wilson is definitely one of them. I'm always heartbroken by missing children's cases in which the victim was allegedly living in an abusive household before they disappeared, and there was a lengthy delay before they were ever reported missing to the authorities and an investigation was launched. Another case like this is the disappearance of twin siblings Yvonne and Inesha Fowler, which was featured on episode number 330 of this podcast. The twins were officially reported missing in 2016 when they should have been 17 years old, but it turned out that no one had actually seen them since they were infants, and it seemed clear that their mother was lying about what happened to them, and their disappearances somehow managed to slip through the cracks for nearly 2 decades. We know that Rilya Wilson was missing for at least 15 months before anyone noticed, and sadly, this is far from the only case I've seen in which a missing child's guardian was more than happy to continue collecting benefits intended for their care, even when the child was no longer a part of their household. Now, this case could almost considered to be a half-solved mystery, because even though Rilya's former foster mother, Geralyn Graham, was not convicted of her murder, she was found guilty of kidnapping and aggravated child abuse and received multiple prison sentences totaling 55 years. Geralyn will likely never get out of prison alive, so if you believe she was guilty of causing Rilya's disappearance, then I guess justice was technically served. However, since Rilya's remains have still never been found, Geralyn has never admitted any culpability, and the actual evidence of foul play was weak at best, this definitely does not feel like a satisfying conclusion. While I believe the odds of this are pretty minuscule, I suppose you can't completely discount the possibility that Rilya was abducted, or Geralyn could have sold the child or given her away, which means that Rilya is still alive out there somewhere today at the age of 29, living under a new identity with no idea of who she really is. I mean, I don't think that's very likely, but I guess you can't prove it didn't happen. I will say that one of the biggest reasons this story was so difficult to cover was because most of the adults who were involved are extremely dislikable. It goes without saying that Geralyn Graham is an odious human being, and even if Pamela Graham was not directly involved in Rilya's disappearance or the alleged abuse she suffered, Pamela did nothing to stop it and helped cover for Geralyn. Rilya's birth mother, Gloria Wilson, was obviously not fit to be raising children since she had no less than 4 daughters with a number of different men before her parental rights were terminated, and to this day, we're not even completely certain who Rilya's biological father was. Of course, everyone associated with the Florida Department of Children and Families came across incredibly badly, and even though I should like the law enforcement officials and prosecutors who tried to seek justice for Rilya and put Geralyn in prison, the fact that their case seemed to hinge on the testimony of a very unreliable jailhouse informant left me with a bad taste in my mouth. If there's someone in this story who did come across as half-decent, it was Pamela Kendrick, who was Rilya's foster mother for a few years before she wound up with Geralyn. This is the part of the story which infuriates me the most, because if Rilya had gotten to remain with Kendrick, then perhaps she could have been raised in a loving home and grown up into a stable adult, and this whole terrible story would not have happened. While it sounds like there were a few concerns about Kendrick's home, often being in a state of disarray, overall, she seemed to be a loving and responsible guardian, and multiple witnesses said that Rilya was a happy, well-adjusted child while living with her. The only reason Kendrick lost custody is because Geralyn complained to the DCF and told him that Rilya was living in unsanitary conditions and literally playing next to a pile of feces on the floor, but I do not believe these allegations were ever verified. Rilya's caseworker, Deborah Muskelly, has always been vilified for not checking up on her and fudging a bunch of false reports about home visitations which never happened, but while she definitely deserves all the flack she got, equal blame should also be assigned to her supervisor, Willie Harris, who resigned alongside Muskelly when the scandal broke. Harris had been working for the DCF for around 30 years at that point, and was described as being a very ineffectual boss who barely oversaw his employees and pretty much let them do what they wanted, which is why Muskelly was able to get away with fudging her reports for so long. But at the time Rilya was removed from Pamela Kendrick's home, Muskelly was actually on vacation, so it was Harris who paid a visit to Kendrick's residence after receiving Geralyn's complaints. However, according to Kendrick, when Harris showed up, Rilya was at daycare, so they had a discussion outside her house and she refused to let him in. Harris then proceeded to pick up Rilya at her daycare center and place the child in Geralyn's custody, but no one ever went back to collect Rilya's toys or clothing from Kendrick's residence. Muskelly would later say that she disagreed with Harris's decision and begged him to allow Rilya to be returned to Kendrick without success. Now, even though Geralyn's allegations about Rilya living in an unfit environment at Kendrick's residence were never proven, I can understand Harris erring on the side of caution, as he stated, quote, "I couldn't prove she wasn't at risk." But the issue is that apparently no one from the DCF bothered to perform any sort of background check on Geralyn because she practically redefined being an unfit foster parent. She had previously spent time in prison for fraud, lived under a number of different aliases, was involved in many lawsuits, and had been diagnosed with dementia and organic personality syndrome. Given the circumstances, it's all the more baffling that the DCF had previously allowed Geralyn to take in Rilya's younger sister, Rodrika. Like I mentioned earlier, this is far from the only case I know where a child was lost in the foster care system after winding up with a guardian who should never have had them in the first place. I know that the whole system is underfunded and these agencies are often understaffed with overworked employees, but this whole story is just a catastrophic failure on a number of different levels. To be fair, it was Pamela Graham, not Geralyn, who was technically designated to be Rilya's temporary legal guardian, so maybe the DCF felt that Pamela would be a fit foster parent. If you've been wondering why Geralyn was charged with kidnapping, it was based on the fact that Geralyn allegedly locked Rilya inside a dog cage and inside a laundry room against the consent of the child's guardian, Pamela, so the state felt that this fit the definition of kidnapping. But of course, it sounds like Pamela was well aware this was going on and did nothing to stop it. The relationship between Geralyn and Pamela is definitely one of the strangest aspects of this story, as they passed themselves off as sisters for a while, but it turned out they were not related and were actually a couple. When Geralyn went on trial, the narrative which was presented is that since there was an 18-year age gap between them, Geralyn was the dominant partner in the relationship and Pamela was often afraid of her, which is why she allowed Geralyn to get away with all this abusive behavior and helped her cover up Rilya's disappearance. Of course, given that Pamela's testimony was one of the primary pieces of evidence against Geralyn, I can't say with absolute certainty that this narrative was 100% true, but if many of the details Pamela provided are accurate, then Geralyn truly was a monster. If you want to hear some good news for once in this story, it was reported that Rilya's three sisters, Rodrika, Rena, and Randy, were adopted by other families, and while I don't know what ultimately happened to Rodrika and Rena, it sounds like Randy turned out pretty well. When Geralyn went on trial, Randy, who is now 18 years old and going under the name Brandy Sims, actually showed up there with her adoptive father, a Miami-based pastor named Willie Sims. In 1995, when Randy/Brandy was still an infant, Rilya Wilson had actually shown up at Willie's church asking for help to turn her life around. At one point, Rilya asked Willie and his wife to watch over Randy while she left on a weekend trip, but Rilya never returned and abandoned her child for good. Willie and his wife then arranged to legally adopt Randy, and in an ironic twist of fate, the DCF caseworker who was assigned to check in on them was Deborah Muskelly. When she was 4 years old, Randy did briefly get to meet her half-sister Rilya on one occasion at a birthday party, but she was too young to remember the experience. But Randy/Brandy's appearance at Geralyn's trial was a very bittersweet moment because it showed how Rilya's life may have ultimately turned out if she had been allowed to remain with Pamela Kendrick. Now, if you go back and research the contemporary media coverage of this case, it's quite interesting to see how this story evolved, as during the initial stages of the investigation, Geralyn was portrayed as a sympathetic figure, and law enforcement flat out stated that they did not consider her to be a suspect. The DCF were definitely the big villains in the story, and it sounds like investigators were willing to accept Geralyn's account that a woman posing as a DCF caseworker had taken Rilya from her residence for a so-called medical evaluation and then never brought her back. Even though the DCF had nothing in their records to indicate that Rilya had been removed from the household, there are other documented cases in which people have impersonated social workers and shown up at people's residence in order to kidnap their own children, either because they want to sell them off on the black market or raise the child as their own. However, once Geralyn and Pamela underwent polygraph tests which showed signs of deception from both of them, and investigators delved into Geralyn's troubled background, they began to believe that something did not add up. Regardless of what you believe happened to Rilya, I think everyone can agree that Geralyn's story about her being taken away by a DCF caseworker is completely bogus. I might be willing to give Geralyn the benefit of the doubt that she got conned by a woman who perpetuated an elaborate kidnapping scheme if there weren't so many holes in her story. Of course, there's the fact that Geralyn and Pamela both spent an entire year committing fraud by continuing to accept paychecks and state benefits for Rilya's care, even though the child was no longer living in their home. Geralyn claimed that she phoned and visited the DCF numerous times to inquire about Rilya's whereabouts, but the DCF had no record of this, and while I could attribute that to them being chaotic and disorganized, there seemed to be a disturbing lack of urgency from Geralyn over the fact that she did not see Rilya for over a year. This is especially troubling once you learn that Geralyn showed up to interviews with a DCF employee named Mary Rosado to make arrangements to receive financial assistance and showed her a fabricated court order granting her legal custody of Rilya, yet conveniently did not mention that Rilya was supposedly in DCF custody at that time. Deborah Muskelly also claimed that she spoke to Geralyn on the phone on 2 occasions after January of 2001, and Geralyn told her that Rilya was still living in her home and never mentioned anything about the DCF caseworker. And when Muskelly resigned and Dora Betancourt was assigned Rilya's case, she said she had a hard time reaching Geralyn and Pamela on the phone, and they never mentioned anything about Rilya's disappearance until she paid a visit to the residence. It appears that they were hoping that the DCF would not even notice that Rilya was missing until they were forced to fabricate a cover story. Another big issue is that it does not sound like Geralyn or Pamela shared this story about the DCF caseworker to anyone else in their personal life during the 15-month period before Rilya was reported missing. Instead, we have no less than 6 witnesses who claim that Geralyn fed them a story about this Spanish woman who took Rilya on a trip to New York for Christmas and was keeping the child at her own residence in Miami. Geralyn would attempt to account for this by saying that the DCF caseworker kidnapped Rilya after the Spanish woman returned her to them, but it's funny how Geralyn never mentioned the Spanish woman during her original statements to the police until after the other witnesses told them the story. While Geralyn listed January the 18th, 2001 as the date when Rilya was taken from her, a medical worker claimed that Geralyn brought Roderica to them for a checkup sometime in February of 2001, and Rilya was with them. I will give some benefit of the doubt here that the medical worker could be mistaken, because Pamela would later claim that Rilya went missing in December of 2000, but either way, it's clear that Geralyn is lying. So the account provided by Pamela at Geralyn's trial is that she went to work one day and Geralyn called her to say that she was taking Rilya on a quote-unquote errand. By the time Pamela returned home, Rilya was gone, and even though Pamela repeatedly begged her to reveal what happened, Geralyn refused to give her a straight answer. At one point, Pamela picked up the phone and threatened to call the authorities, but Geralyn picked up a hammer and demanded that Pamela put the phone down. Geralyn conceded that she never hurt Rilya and assured Pamela that the child was okay, but said that she wouldn't see her anymore. If Pamela's version of events is true, and she was not present when Rilya went missing, then there is technically no direct evidence of foul play, and this could explain why there was one holdout juror who was willing to convict Geralyn on the kidnapping and child abuse charges, but still felt there was enough reasonable doubt not to vote guilty on the murder charge. There's undoubtedly ample evidence that Geralyn lied about the circumstances of Rilya's disappearance and was withholding information, but was this enough to prove that she killed the child? Well, I'm always perturbed by murder trials where the primary piece of evidence is the testimony of the defendant's alleged co-conspirator, because you never know if they're fudging the facts in order to portray themselves in the best possible light. Pamela wound up receiving a sentence of probation and only had to serve 1 year in the county jail in exchange for her testimony, but does she really have no direct first-hand knowledge of what happened to Rilya? Or could she have been more complicit in the cover-up than she's letting on? What's also interesting is that Geralyn's 2 adult children, Leo and Jaclyn Epson, were arrested alongside her and Pamela on fraud charges, and while they both also received sentences of probation and community service, Leo, Jaclyn, and Pamela could have had their community service hours canceled if they agreed to be questioned about Rilya's case and take lie detector tests. Yet all 3 of them refused to go along with this, which makes me wonder if they all knew more about Rilya's disappearance than they were letting on. The thing that really concerns me is that due to the injuries that Rilya sustained in a car accident a few years earlier, she was considered to be legally disabled and also suffered from a number of mental health issues, including organic personality syndrome. If Geralyn killed Rilya, would she really have been capable of disposing of the child's body on her own and done such a thorough job that no trace of her has been found in 25 years? This is why it's tempting to believe that whatever happened, Rilya had someone else assist her with the cover-up. So this brings us to Robin Lunsford, and regardless of my personal feelings about Geralyn, I still have issues with the fact that the case against her relied so heavily on Lunsford's testimony, as she is pretty much the personification of everything that is wrong with jailhouse informants. Lunsford was a career criminal who had a history of volunteering to testify at murder trials in exchange for a reduction of her prison sentences. In fact, Lunsford stuck her nose into another famous case which took place in Florida during this time period, and that's Casey Anthony's trial for the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee Anthony. Before that trial started, Lunsford had gotten in touch with Casey's defense attorney, Jose Baez, to warn him that other inmates at the Orange County Jail were going to feed the prosecution false information about Casey. Lunsford initially claimed that she was going to testify against Geralyn because it was simply the right thing to do, but had a sudden change of heart when she learned she was going to receive the sentence reduction she wanted, and the whole thing turned into such a mess that there wound up being a gap of nearly 8 years between when Geralyn was indicted for murder and her trial finally started. In the end, Lunsford wound up getting a sweetheart deal in which her life sentence was reduced to 10 years, but, surprise, surprise, shortly after she was released from prison, Lunsford wound up being rearrested on a probation violation, and one of the weirdest details is that she was now sporting a tattoo with the name Rilya. To recap, Lunsford's story is that while sharing a cell with Geralyn, she heard her make a tearful confession to killing Rilya because she was quote-unquote evil and plagued by quote-unquote demons. Geralyn also apparently said that the major breaking point was when Rilya refused to wear an angel costume for Halloween and wanted to dress up as Cleopatra instead, which made Geralyn realize that the child was evil and had to die. Now, on the one hand, Lunsford obviously has major credibility issues, and that story doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, the detail about the Halloween costumes is so bizarre that you have to wonder if a person could just dream something like that up on her own. One of my biggest issues with that story is the timeline, as Pamela claimed that she last saw Rilya in December of 2000, but if Jaclyn killed Rilya over her choice of a Halloween costume, wouldn't this imply that her death occurred sometime in October? The other possibility, however, is that Lunsford is genuinely telling the truth, and Geralyn really did say this, but her story is just a bunch of incoherent nonsense. Once again, Geralyn had been diagnosed with dementia and organic personality syndrome, which can cause hallucinations and similar symptoms to schizophrenia, so perhaps she really did make these comments about Rilya, which have no basis in reality. Alternatively, if Geralyn's mental health issues have progressed enough, it's possible she genuinely can't remember the exact circumstances of what happened to Rilya, but every now and then, fragments will pop back into her memory and bits and pieces of the truth will come flowing out. Two other jailhouse informants, Ramona Tavia and Maggie Carr, provided testimony about incriminating statements that Geralyn supposedly made, and since they were both convicted murderers, I don't believe they received any deals or sentence reductions in exchange for their testimony. But they claimed that she made cryptic comments about killing a baby to protect her quote-unquote sister, which I assume was in reference to Pamela, and disposing of the child's body near some water. I don't know if Geralyn had full control of her mental faculties during these statements, so either she was rambling about stuff that never happened, or she just had a tendency to let loose fragments of truth from time to time. So we know that Rilya's youngest sister, Roderica, was in foster care with Geralyn and Pamela before Rilya was brought into their household, and while it sounds like Roderica was neglected, I haven't heard anything about her being subject to the same physical abuse that Rilya supposedly experienced. Like I mentioned earlier, Roderica was removed from the home shortly after Rilya went missing and was adopted by another family, and while I have no idea how she's doing today, she was only around 2 years old at the time of Rilya's disappearance, so I don't think she could offer any insight into what happened. Geralyn claimed that Rilya had a lot of behavioral issues, and she often had to protect Roderica, as Rilya would supposedly lash out at her sister by doing things like smothering her with a pillow and attempting to drown her in the bathtub. However, this seems to be in sharp contrast to Rilya's behavior while she was living at Pamela Kendrick's residence, as numerous witnesses described her as being a happy, well-adjusted child there. If the allegations of abuse towards Rilya are accurate, then it's all the more infuriating that Geralyn managed to successfully convince the DCF to remove Rilya from Kendrick's care and place her in her own household, as it really doesn't sound like she had the mental fortitude to be caring for young children during that time period. But we've seen many other cases just like this, where a foster parent will consider a foster child to be a cash cow and will bring them into their home in order to receive checks and benefits from the state, as providing actual love and care for the child is not the priority. Geralyn obviously had no qualms about continuing to defraud the state of these benefits after Rilya was gone, and managed to get away with it for over a year, since the DCF was in such a state of disarray. And unfortunately, this gave Geralyn plenty of time to cover her tracks for whatever she did. When I hear these stories of abuse, the most logical explanation is that Geralyn reached her breaking point and killed Rilya before disposing of her body, and if there's any truth to the so-called confession she gave to Robin Lunsford, then she dumped her into a canal or a lake. Of course, the best case scenario is that there was no foul play, and Geralyn instead gave Rilya away or sold her, which would mean that Rilya might still be alive out there somewhere under a false identity. But if that was the case, wouldn't Geralyn have said something by now? If Geralyn had not been arrested for anything and was still a free woman today, I can understand her still keeping her mouth shut, since selling a child is technically a crime. But Geralyn wound up being charged with several crimes, and if she had been convicted of Rilya's murder, she could have potentially faced the death penalty. If there was a chance that Rilya was still alive, I think Geralyn would have come clean during the nearly 8-year window between the murder indictment and her trial, because even if she was hit with additional charges, that still would have been preferable to the risk of being executed. As it is right now, Geralyn is currently serving a number of prison sentences totaling 55 years and will spend the rest of her life behind bars, so if she had any kind of bargaining chip which would allow Rilya to be found alive, I think she would have used it in order to attempt to reduce her sentence. But of course, the big unanswered questions we have now are the location of Rilya's remains and whether or not she is the only one who knows where to find them. If her dementia and her memory issues have worsened, then I fear that she may have forgotten what she did with Rilya and couldn't reveal the location of her remains even if she wanted to. Given the condition she was in back during the early 2000s, I am still a bit skeptical that Geralyn would have been capable of disposing of Rilya's body on her own, So I continue to wonder if she had assistance at covering the whole thing up, and if there are other people out there, such as Pamela Graham, who know the full truth about what happened. Pamela has already testified against Geralyn and received a reduced sentence for her crimes, so if she was complicit in Rilya's death or the disposal of her body, I can understand why she'd keep her mouth shut to avoid potentially facing other charges, and also because it wouldn't exactly paint her in the best light. I do hope that we get conclusive answers someday, as this remains one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking stories ever featured on this podcast, as poor Rilya was born into such a terrible situation and never got a chance at a decent life, as she was completely failed by the system. But if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Rilya Wilson, please contact the Miami-Dade County Police Department at 305-418-7302. That's 305-418-7302. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Jaclyn Collins for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for over 8 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7.5 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a story from Unsolved Mysteries about a mysterious figure who was supposedly responsible for starting a series of fires in Washington state and causing the death of a firefighter, the King of Arsonists. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1984 murder of Mark Grosinger. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Holly L., Justin W., and Amelia E. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.